Hello, everyone. Good morning. Our panelists are going to be joining us as they sign into Zoom through the live feature here. But I just wanted to welcome everyone to the Ocean Renewable Energy Conference hosted by Pacific Ocean Energy Trust and this panel. This panel is a tradition. I'm Rebecca O'Neill. I work for Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. Just about every year in the last 6 years, I've tried to bring a new panel up to this conference to offer some insights on kind of the larger context for energy today. And this panel is an exceptional version of that opening panel for you. So I want to welcome our panelists. We have Paul Spitsen from the Office of Strategic Analysis within EERE at the Department of Energy, so the federal R&D organization that you're very familiar with. Paul and his part of the organization is different than the Water Power Technologies Office. And so he's going to offer a really different kind of perspective on some of the big cross-cutting efforts at the Department of Energy. So glad to have him here. We also have David Rosner, who's with the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. David is in the Office of Energy Policy. So again, this is not the siting division. This is not the Office of Energy Projects. This is a different part of FERC. FERC is the primary federal regulator of electricity markets, transmission, reliability, and these are some of the things that David is going to be talking about with you guys today. We also have Amit Ronen, who's with Senator Cantwell. Thanks, Amit, for the wave, where he's been working for, I think, 15 years, you said, Amit, in Congress, with some really also different perspectives on national energy policy from the congressional point of view. So these are three very different perspectives on federal policy and energy that I'm glad to be able to offer you today. So I want to share with everyone who's listening a little bit about how we wanted to run this. So I wanted to start out with just some basic questions for each of them to get us all kind of talking to one another and give you guys a little bit more perspective about the roles of these agencies and these entities in the federal space. And then we'll shift towards presentation or kind of a more exposition so they get a chance to get a little bit deeper and richer into their stuff and their perspectives. And then we'll switch back to a Q&A. So if you have any questions, I believe you have an option through the way that you're accessing this conference to ask a question. Those will get sent over to us and we'll make sure we try to get through as many as we can at the end of the panel. So just to kick it off, this panel presentation, the way that I asked Poet to title it is Accelerated Deployment and Resource Diversity, because from where I sit, this seems to be two linchpin kind of policy areas in which marine energy might see some advancement and opportunity, but also that kind of highlight a lot of the bigger issues that are underway in federal policy. So as some of us will talk about shortly, there's a big interest in massive infrastructure, a focus on deployment, a focus on clean energy, on an accelerated time frame, almost to the point where we're talking, and Paul, I think you're going to talk about this a little bit, in parallel tracks, not waiting for there to be a pinch point in the system and then reacting to it with new prices, but actually what is needed in sum total to get to these goals, these very, very aggressive goals, and what kinds of funding and infrastructure is part of that vision. The other piece of it is resource diversity. So we have some opportunity to develop clean energy today in ways that make sense and are cost effective and provide a business model. But what are we doing to make sure that the whole system is going to work at the end of that process and that the system is cost effective? And what is the role of resource diversity, meaning alternative forms of clean energy or different types of technologies that are going to be needed to make clean energy make sense and make a reliable grid? So having a bigger vision for what that future looks like might entail new resource development that requires different strategies than some of the clean energy resources that are already available today. So we're going to hear a little bit about that, I think, with some focus on offshore wind, because that's the one that's sitting on some people's desks right now. But I know that there's a touchstone there for marine energy, just in terms of thinking about the next generation of resources and innovation and what's being done to support those. So that's my goal, is to help think about what is these nexus points. And so to start that, I'm going to ask some softballs of the panel to help everybody kind of warm up and hopefully to get folks listening interested in this conversation. So could I ask everybody, we'll go around to just say a little bit about who your organization is, kind of help people understand what you're representing in the panel today. And Amit, could you go first?
Okay, sure. Thanks, Rebecca and Poet, for the invite. I look forward to the conversation today. I guess I work for the U.S. Senate, but more specifically for United States Senator Maria Cantwell from Washington State, my home state, and you mentioned been doing it for a while. And so my job is basically trying to implement and execute on her priorities, which are, as she states them, as the work of our committees that she is on, is whatever they're processing and working through. And of course, we have constituents, 7 million constituents in Washington State we represent, and we play a big role in national energy policy, and as much as what folks are asking for there, or the president might be asking for. So fundamentally, I'm writing laws, writing speeches, preparing for hearings, and talking to constituents to try and translate all that, both what they want to do, and then talking about what we have done, so they understand and hopefully appreciate it.
Great. Thank you, Amit. David, could you go next, please?
Yes, thank you, Rebecca, and thanks to the Pacific Ocean Energy Trust. I'm very excited to be here at the Ocean Renewable Energy Conference. Excited to engage in the discussion today, and also just want to wish everybody happy fall. My name again is David. I work at FERC, or the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, in the Office of Energy Policy and Innovation. And in case you don't know, FERC is a federal agency created back in the late 70s. It's an independent agency where we have 5 commissioners, and no more than 3 of the 5 can be from the same political party. FERC regulates a number of things. The piece most relevant to this conversation are the rates and services for electric transmission and electric wholesale power sales. I won't go into the rest, but we also do a lot on hydro, natural gas, transportation, oil pipelines, and all those other exciting things. But within FERC, there's the Office of Policy and Innovation, and that's where I work, and we are very much in this forward-looking posture, and we coordinate the development of policies and rules that really try and get at some of the emerging challenges in the electric industry. So we constantly are sort of have our ear to the ground, attending events like this, doing industry outreach, collaborating across the offices of the Commission on things like internal issue papers, sometimes public staff reports, technical conferences where we have a public forum to gather information, and then ultimately, in some cases, Commission rulemakings. And I'd be remiss, I would be a bad FERC staffer if I didn't say that all the views and opinions I express today are mine alone and don't necessarily reflect those of the Commissioner or any Commissioner. Thank you, and back to you, Rebecca.
Thank you, David. All right, Paul, you're up.
Awesome. So my name is Paul Spitzen. I work at DOE, which is kind of the national institution that funds research and development for applied energy technologies. Within that, I work in the renewables office. Unlike kind of the majority of people that work there, I don't focus on any individual specific technology. So I don't work on water or wind or solar. I actually take a technologically cross-cutting position. So we generally do national level analysis of the energy system writ large. So thinking about kind of, how will the system evolve over the next 50 years, and how should we prioritize our R&D from that? So really thinking about, like, what does the system need? What's the biggest things that are driving change? And kind of what are the long-term impacts to both technology as well as the consumer?
Great. Thank you, Paul. It's tough. It's tough. You guys work for massive institutions. So thanks for the thumbnail sketch of who you are and what you work for. I am going to ask another question that hopefully is not too hard, which is, what are you kind of personally, professionally most excited about? There's been a big push across the federal family to get a lot of work done along a lot of different vectors at the same time. It looks like a blizzard from where we sit sometimes. So maybe you could talk about a couple trajectories that are kind of most exciting to you, or that based on your experience have been kind of around, but have somehow crystallized, something that helps us kind of understand which trends are most meaningful to you, not just because they're the biggest pile on your desk, but because you have some thought that they're going to go somewhere, or it's going to make a big difference in the way that we see things from where we sit. So could we go in the same order again, please? Amit, would you mind going first?
Sure. I mean, I guess the name of this panel kind of speaks to what I'm excited about. And, you know, we've seen a wholesale change in the last year in terms of this awareness and growing momentum on the need to try and get to clean energy solutions as fast as we can and address climate. You know, I don't get too political about what's behind it, but it's not just the change in the administration, but again, hearing from constituents, the impacts of climate change coming harder and faster than, you know, we thought even a few years ago. So stuff that we've been working on for 15 plus years, ideas are suddenly not only being accepted, but, you know, we're doubling down in terms of the funding. So the most exciting thing is probably following in the news as we have this potentially very big reconciliation package, infrastructure package, where, you know, we're talking in trillions of dollars, momentous policy changes that accompany that funding, not just the policy, but also the funding itself and what it does. And, you know, just with David at FERC, you know, people didn't even used to know what FERC was except for wonky people, but now people know what FERC is because of the key role that they're going to play in this clean energy. And we have all 5 of the FERC commissioners before the Energy Committee next week, so they'll be getting all these kind of questions. So that's what we're excited about, but also, as you mentioned, a blizzard is happening. We're pretty underwater, but trying to get some good things to get to the finish line.
I like that, underwater. It's a good pun for marine energy. They're abundant, though. You kind of can't help yourself. I know. I do it anyway. David, could you go next?
Sure, and this is a great question, and it's really hard to separate. I mean, what's on the desk from what I'm excited about. I mean, the answer is really both. But I mean, I can just tell you, I've never been so busy as I have since January. So that's good. My family's upset about that, but you know, that's okay. It's working itself out. But for me, I've been spending a lot of time on offshore wind, and I'm really excited about that. And that's been at the commission predominantly East Coast focused, where I'm sure many of the people on with us today know that, you know, there's some really ambitious state goals, and as are there a lot of interest in other places too. But on the East Coast, over 30,000 megawatts in law and moving very quickly. Big investments already occurred. And we've just been trying to figure out how to get the transmission right so that we can minimize costs, do it efficiently, and be smart about minimizing impacts to the environment and to communities. And I think, you know, I'm very hopeful that this is a story that's going to have a happy ending. Things are, from my perspective, are going in the right direction for sure. And it really dovetails nicely with some of the commission's other work, which I hope to talk about a little later on transmission writ large. The commission typically has a fuel neutral lens. The chairman recently announced a major effort to think through or rethink how we plan transmission, which is going to be really important for getting a lot of these new technologies from the areas in which that energy is produced to load centers. And the piecemeal approach to date, Chairman, you know, Glick doesn't think is working so well. And I think there's a lot we can do there. I'm also excited, you know, FERC's, you know, kind of a geeky place. We do markets, and there's a lot of work on market rules to get the prices right. And that is very important also. So I'll leave it there. If people want to talk prices, we can, but that's probably good enough for now.
Please no. But I do love, David, you just used some words like fuel neutral, piecemeal approaches versus what else could FERC do. So hopefully you're going to talk a little bit more about that and decode that for folks here. Those are really important ideas. All right, Paula?
Awesome, yeah. So for me, the thing I'm most excited about essentially is the rapid decrease we've seen in renewable energy technology cost. And also the increased performance. I think this makes the kind of this clean energy transition a real possibility and reality almost. I'm also excited because essentially these technology cost declines are also supported now by increased policy from both the state and federal level, and an increased infrastructure push from Congress. So I really think you kind of have the perfect storm of factors coming together at the right time to really make a push to make the clean energy future a reality.
Well said. All right, last question, and then we'll go to our presentations. Maybe you can just talk about actually this resource diversity piece, because we've all kind of already just touched on accelerated deployment and how it's coming. But what does it mean to think about the next generation of resources versus the ones that are already available in the market today? And what do you think the relationship is between the energy policies we're building and the place where you sit, and the idea that we need to think about alternative energy options that are not available in the marketplace today? I think Jason articulated it for us before. There's been this funny catch-22 of being either market ready or being deployment focused, right? One of the two, and they get stuck in the middle sometimes in this industry. So not specific to marine energy, but could you talk for a moment about anything that you see related to this issue of needing more types of renewable energy, or needing to see more market ready solutions? What's required to make that happen, to get over that hump? Can we go backwards this time around? Paul, could you start, please?
Sure. So I think, like, one, the grid is evolving, and so the needs of the grid will change over time. So, right now, wind and solar are great. They're least cost. They can be pretty much deployed anywhere. However, kind of as you start to hit higher and higher penetrations of those technologies, you start potentially incurring supply and demand imbalances. And I think that's where you start to see other technologies come into play, either kind of just because of a geographic sense, a timing sense. So you have like offshore wind and coastal states, you have marine energy, potentially geothermal, things like that. But you also have other technologies like energy storage, and increasingly longer and longer durations of energy storage, to deal with both kind of the diurnal mismatch, but also potential seasonal mismatches. And for the seasonal stuff, you also see kind of the nascent technologies like, hydrogen, coming in to even play a larger role to ensure that we have essentially adequacy over longer periods of time in all seasons. So I think, kind of like I said, like, there's still a large space for new technologies to play a very large role. I think it's just going to depend on kind of the local circumstances and how the grid actually ends up evolving.
Appreciate it. And there's going to be some really specific discussions of that, I think, on the next panel with regard to this sector. So David, what about you?
Well, I sort of see the work of the commission as like, once Amit's policies have been implemented and Paul has worked to get the R&D and D done, then they get to us, and they want to get into the market. And we spend a lot of time thinking about, as new things come along, are there barriers to those technologies? Do our rules work? Are the rules right? And a good example of that is energy storage, where that was something that our office started looking at many years ago. And then under Chairman Bay, we maybe 5 or 6 years ago now, we started a rulemaking proposal to change some of those rules. Because as storage is a little bit different. We have all these markets where people are just selling, they're generating, and it takes some different rules to for a resource that can do both sell and buy, and also is really fast, like storage, and also has some unique sort of market protection sort of issues around the way people might use storage. I just see like I said, this office that I'm in, we're constantly thinking about what's coming next and how it fits. And I think, we'll talk more in a bit, but, in the advanced notice of proposed rulemaking that's out for public comment now on transmission planning, we're really looking very broadly. We're thinking about how to, again, plan in a resource neutral way, but that doesn't preclude us from, if there's a certain resource that needs a special treatment, from finding a way to do that. And we've seen things, progress on, some of these location constrained renewable resources. There have been things that the commission's approved that move those forward. So I'll leave it there. Thanks.
It's really helpful. Thank you, David. And it's not just barriers, right? With storage, it's also attributes of storage that aren't able to be captured because of the structures of the market as well, right? So I
Oh,
remember
absolutely. Absolutely, yeah. There's a lot of value to unlock. I think many of the grid operators want to use those characteristics. It's certainly helpful. So
that's great. Thank you for that, Amit.
All right. Well, I'll focus on the policy stuff since that's what I think about. But I have make sure to emphasize what Paul does on, say, R&D and technical issues, and what David's doing on regulatory and making sure everything's just and reasonable prices. Those are absolutely fundamental too. But three big kind of buckets that we're looking at on the policy side. One is a national net zero goal or requirement of some sort is probably coming sooner or later in some structure. Obviously, some states are ahead of us. Washington State's already done it, but there'll probably be one at a federal level that will impact ocean energy development. We have a very robust package that we're talking about now on clean energy tax credits. I'll talk about a little about that later, but that's been a key market driver, actually probably the most influential energy policy we've had in the last 2 decades on when it comes to renewables. And then finally, don't give up yet, because it'll come sooner or later, but a price on carbon is coming in one form or another.
I'm just letting that sink in for a second. Well, great. Thank you all for entertaining these questions and kind of warming us all up to how each of us think about these issues. Now we're going to switch into some deeper dives from each of the panelists. So the order here is Paul, and then to David, and then to Amit. Paul, I believe you have slides, but David and Amit, I believe you do not, right? So Paul, do you want to drive? And the rest of us will take a back seat.
Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Awesome. Slideshow mode. Perfect. Awesome. Here we go. Awesome. So essentially, one of the things that DOE does is conduct scenario analysis to look far in the future to see how the power system will evolve. And when I say DOE, I really mean the national labs, because they're the true brain power behind doing a lot of this research. So I just want to give them credit where it's due. And at this point, we've conducted quite a few studies looking at various aspects of this evolution. So, in general, it's kind of renewable energy integration, electrification on the demand side, transmission expansion and integration across regions, things like that. And I think we're starting to see kind of a couple broad trends come to light, and those are what I want to talk about later. But just to give you kind of a better sense of what scenario analysis means, kind of this table here at the bottom, and it's really thinking about kind of on the investment side, what gets built and where, and then on the end use side, what gets adopted. So like rooftop solar, EVs, et cetera. And then the other half is kind of on the operational side, how is the grid operating? How is it being balanced? How is there operational changes? And then ensuring that it's reliable for every hour of the year, essentially. So it kind of comes to the first big finding on the demand side. In order to meet decarbonization goals, most people think that electrification is one of the most viable pathways. Electrifying kind of end uses across all the sectors, so transportation, commercial and residential buildings, as well as the industrial sector, will probably increase electricity demand, and not insignificantly. And so kind of the figure on the left comes from the electrification future study, and it shows kind of 3 different scenarios of increased electrification, reference, medium, and high. And kind of, as you can see by the color coding, most of this increased demand comes from the electrification of the light duty vehicle fleet, roughly between in this study, 11% the reference case, 80% in the high case. But that's a significantly increasing demand out to 2050. And thinking of so obviously EVs are a big player on the building side. It's really thinking about electrifying kind of heating and cooling. So thinking about high temperature heat pumps in buildings and things like that. Obviously, you don't see that much industrial electrification. That's just because a lot of those applications have high temperature requirements, and electrochemical or electro technologies aren't, or at least at this point, are not kind of viable for a lot of those applications. Although I will say that we still can electrify a lot of low temperature applications. So there's still going to be some electrification in the industrial sector. But I really want to point out here that it's not just the aggregate increased demand that's important. It's also how the loads will change over time, because that can definitely introduce some unique pinch points for grid operation. And so switching from kind of the demand side to the supply side, I really want to point out that across all the studies, we kind of see high levels of clean energy deployment. And I will say that in scenarios where we start thinking about achieving our climate goals, this deployment needs to happen at an unprecedented rate. So we're talking about essentially doubling or tripling deployment from historic levels on an annual basis. So I just want to say that like the amount of clean energy we need to deploy is massive over the next 25 to 30 years. And so the figure on the left essentially shows kind of three different trajectories. The yellow lines are essentially no new policy going out of the future, so no carbon constraints. The green line essentially is a 95% power sector CO2 cap by 2050. And the blue line show a 95% CO2 cap by 2035 and 100% CO2 cap by 2050. The dashed lines essentially represent kind of the mid-cost case, and then the other lines represent other cost and infrastructure sensitivities that we examined. And so as you can see, kind of across all cases, we do see this continual upward trend for clean energy deployment. Potentially all the way up to 80% of the power system could be renewable energy if that was a least cost option. And as you can see, kind of looking at the generation mix, a couple of trends emerge. Wind and solar are going to be deployed in very large amounts because they are least cost resources in most parts of the country. But that being said, though, you also see other slivers of other technologies starting to emerge, and especially if you start talking about accelerating deployment in the 2035 time period. So offshore wind, has a large role to play. Hydro has a role to play, and other technologies can have a role to play. And I will say that this modeling is generally done in a least cost optimization, so it doesn't necessarily take into account all the real world factors that influence deployment. So thinking of things of like regional economic benefits or additional siting constraints or things like that. So in reality, there's still a lot of space for other technologies that might deploy that might not be least cost. So I know that this is a marine energy conference, so there's not a lot of marine energy on these charts, but it doesn't mean that they won't deploy in the future. Kind of the next piece is infrastructure. So kind of again, across all the scenarios, we see transmission expansion increases renewable energy deployment and efficient grid operation. So this is from the North American Renewable Integration Study. And essentially, so one of the things transmission does, it allows access to higher quality resource areas. So thinking about things like, the middle of the country has the best wind resource. And so obviously we need to build transmission in order to access that resource and then move it to load centers, which are primarily located on the East Coast. And the same thing applies for things like offshore wind and also marine energy. You have to build transmission to access that resource. And then the other piece about this is that building increased transmission allows for kind of the variability problem of renewable energies to go away, because you're able to shift power to where it's needed at different times. And kind of the last piece in the operational sense is building transmission across regions essentially provides long-term benefits. So, in the narrow study, just looking at interregional transmission within the United States, it showed essentially $180 of benefits to $1 billion of benefits to the system through 2050. So that's not something to scoff at. So obviously we still have significant hurdles to building transmission in our country, but I think that if we can overcome those, and it looks like we're moving that direction thanks to work that David's doing with FERC and others, we should be able to realize some of those benefits. Kind of the last piece here is that, so when we're talking about increased clean energy deployment, like I said before, you start to see kind of two types of imbalances that need to be overcome. You see this kind of diurnal imbalance. So essentially what happens, when the wind's not blowing in a given day and the sun's not shining. And this can be solved essentially with energy storage technologies. And so roughly diurnal imbalances can be overcome with anything between 2 and 12-hour storage. So right now, the primary technology that people talk about essentially is a 4-hour lithium-ion battery. And the other side of that is we have a large fleet of roughly 12-hour pump storage hydro assets across the country. But there's still lots of room for other technologies to of various durations to help fill that gap, and that need will only increase over time, is what's shown in this kind of the figure, as you see this upward trend as time moves on for kind of a variety of durations. And then the second piece, which I want to talk about, is the seasonal imbalances. So it's once we can solve the diurnal problem, we're fine, but there's still going to be potential whole seasons where various resources might have lower output than we expect, and to overcome that, we have historically relied on dispatchable fossil assets, so things like natural gas peakers. But when you move to a clean energy future, obviously we can't run that uncontrolled fossil asset. So really have to think about new technologies, and that's probably going to be either some sort of new long duration storage technology that has 100+ type duration, or some other type of clean fuel based solution. So things like a hydrogen combustion turbine or something like that. And so I wanted to flag out that that's kind of the forefront of solving kind of this move to the clean energy future. And that kind of takes me to my last point, which is actually a new DOE initiative that got rolled out last year and that we're continuing to build on, but it's Energy Storage Grand Challenge. And so this is a DOE-wide program to coordinate energy storage research. Again, it's focused on kind of the whole spectrum of technology, so bidirectional storage, flexible generation, controllable loads, as well as chemical and thermal storage. And I will say, again, this is a department-wide effort, which is very unique for us because we generally work in silos all the time, but it really does cut across all the different applied offices, as well as kind of the Office of Science that focuses on basic R&D. And again, we're also focused on kind of the whole deployment chain. It's everything from basic R&D to applied R&D to demonstration and validation, kind of the post-processing analysis and TA that also is associated with deploying the asset, as well as kind of commercialization strategies, both inside the US and then kind of abroad. And again, so kind of, I think with this effort, the real objective here is to accelerate kind of deployment in a cost-effective way and make the US a leader in energy storage, because we feel that that's going to be one of the main kind of enablers of the clean energy future going forward. And so with that, I'll return it back over so we can ask questions and go to David.
Thank you, Paul. That was great. That was a lot of content, but I really appreciate it. And folks, if you have any questions, please go ahead and just type them in the chat, and then we'll make sure that we try to get to them at the end. So as they occur to you, please go ahead and enter them in. All right, David, your turn. David, you're muted. Oh, yeah.
Still forgetting that 18 months into this. Okay, I was hoping to cover 3 things, one of which was give an overview of the commission. We did that, awesome. The other 2 are talk a little bit about the commission's advance notice of proposed rulemaking, which is titled Building for the Future Through Electric Regional Transmission Planning and Cost Allocation and Generator Interconnection. And that title should give you a little bit of a flavor for what it's like to work at FERC, but I will try and stay much higher level than that. And then finally, I'd love to tell you a little bit about some of the work the Commission's been doing on offshore wind integration in regional transmission organizations. So first, Advance Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, or a NOPR. This was a document published in the Federal Register July 27th this year. It is open for public comment right now through October 12th. So I hope that anyone in this group who has an interest, that you file comments, because those really help us. The ANOPR, I will just, before I get into the ANOPR, I'll just say the major transmission planning issues, just colloquially raised by stakeholders, are questions like, why haven't we seen interregional transmission projects? How do we address the concerns about regional cost allocation methods? And how do we apply those to specific situations that might present themselves? For instance, when we integrate a specific technology or group of resources. Is the transmission planning process identifying the transmission that's really needed to meet the system needs? And how does transmission planning and interconnection, how do they work together? So those are some of the questions we've been hearing for many years. And then as it articulated by the NOPR, the problem statement there is that the electric generating fleet is shifting very quickly from resources that have been located close to population centers to resources that in many cases include renewables that are often located far from those centers. So together, the growth of new resources that are seeking to interconnect into the transmission system and the different characteristics of those resources are creating these new demands on the transmission system and for transmission. So as Chairman Glick said, the piecemeal approach to date to expanding the transmission system is just not going to get the job done. We have to take steps today to build the transmission system that tomorrow's new generating resources will require. So in In light of those evolving conditions, the Commission proposed the ANOPR, which is again is seeking comment on whether we should make changes to the regional transmission and cost allocation and generator interconnection processes that the Commission currently oversees. So at a very high level, the reforms in the ANOPR, they think about the need for holistic transmission planning and cost allocation and generator interconnection processing changes to plan for this grid of the future, and do so in a way that ensures that rates are just and reasonable. So there's three specific areas of reform. The first is reforms for longer term regional transmission planning and cost allocation processes that take into account, again, this more holistic planning, which includes planning for anticipated future generation. It also rethinks the cost responsibility for regional transmission and interconnection related network upgrades. And finally, there are components of the ANOPR that contemplate enhanced transmission oversight over how new transmission facilities are identified and paid for. So I'll just give a quick flavor of some of the more specific reforms. The first on planning, the ANOPR asks the question of whether there should be changes in how to plan for future scenarios, including the planning for anticipated future generation as part of the regional transmission planning and cost allocation processes. Right now, there are regional planning processes that where they consider things like state public policies, but there are concerns among stakeholders that those aren't working well. There's also a reform question in the ANOPR whether the Commission should require transmission providers in each transmission planning region to establish a process where they identify specific geographic zones that have the potential for development of large amounts of renewable energy generation, and then plan the transmission to facilitate the integration of renewable resources in those zones. And we've seen projects like these before, thinking CREZ in Texas, among others. And then whether reforms are needed to improve the coordination between regional transmission planning and cost allocation and the generator interconnection processes. Are we measuring the right benefits, and are we assigning costs according to those who benefit from these projects? The Commission is also taking comment on whether participant funding of interconnection related network upgrades are just and reasonable. And what that means is that when a generator seeks to interconnect, if they have to upgrade the transmission system, this is like not just like the lead line to a wind farm, but the high voltage transmission over a certain level, or those related transmission facilities, those would typically be, the cost responsibility of those would typically be for the interconnecting generator. And the ANOPR is considering whether there are broader benefits of those transmission system upgrades and whether those costs should be assigned to others beyond the interconnection generator. And finally, the ANOPR also is seeking comment on whether coordination between regions is working well, and whether there are opportunities to do more interregional planning. And that's something that's come up a lot when we've talked with folks in the offshore wind space, where right now these first projects are moving forward, often with individual generator lead line approaches, but we have studies showing that if we could build offshore backbone or these regional or interregional scope processes, that could be much more efficient and lower cost. But that the planning processes right now might not be enabling that. So the ANOPR is taking comment on that as well. I also wanted to talk a bit about the work that the Commission has underway on offshore wind integration. I think that this, while this work has been focused in RTOs and ISOs predominantly in the East Coast, I think that there's some lessons learned from here that I think are broadly applicable as folks think about integrating ocean renewable energy out west as well. So this work started back in October 2020, where we convened a technical conference. And a technical conference is merely a public forum where stakeholders come to the Commission and engage in a discussion with the Commission, the chairman, and staff. And the goal of this was to think through whether the existing frameworks that the Commission has in place, whether they can accommodate all of the anticipated offshore wind generation efficiently and effectively. So some of the general themes coming out of that conference was that most panelists strongly agreed that continuing this piecemeal generator lead line approach to integrate offshore wind is going to be inefficient and expensive in the long term. It's not going to be sustainable. We had some RTOs and ISOs say that there could be challenges incorporating state public policies, which in the East Coast, those state public policies are procurement of offshore wind generating resources. Whether that there could be challenges integrating those into their existing regional transmission planning processes. And one of the reasons for that is that in a multi-state RTO, they often require some form of consensus to identify public policy needs, to then put those needs into the regional plan. And the multi-state RTOs have a problem there, whereas in single state RTOs, we heard from New York ISO and the California ISO, said that they don't see those issues, that because their state borders more or less align with the border of the planning region and the ISO, that their current processes are working well here. Many panelists also noted that to effectively integrate offshore wind, that the planning processes really need to consider a broader set of future scenarios, looking out over a longer time horizon, looking out over more benefits than they currently do. And what that means is typically the planning window is 10 years, but with a new technology like offshore wind and other marine technologies, we know that those lead times are much longer. You know, we're doing something for the first time. There's a lot of related infrastructure that has to come first. And in many cases, the state deployment targets are, 10, 15 years out into the future. So that means that when we put offshore wind into the current planning processes, that we're only seeing the first piece of that. And then the models will solve based on an incomplete picture of the future. So some states like New York have already made changes to their process where they look out to 2030. Multi-state RTOs like ISO New England has just started a process to try and do some longer term planning. And there's been great state engagement in that. And hopefully we'll hear more from them soon. In March of this year, following that conference, we issued a call for post-conference comments, and we heard from 31 different entities, more than 500 pages of comments. And I'll just go through some of the general themes very quickly. Again, we heard really strongly that a planned offshore transmission network to integrate offshore wind has many benefits, but that this will be more complex and that the increased scale could increase risks. The transmission solutions to integrate multiple offshore wind projects, definitely commenters saw that as reducing impacts on communities and the environment, fewer points of interconnection, greater scale, but that there are these risks there too, that to the generation, that if the transmission is late, that could have, effectively strand generation, where the generator could be completed before the transmission is ready. In the near term, our commenters found that most of the near-term projects are going to come through the generator lead line approach. We also heard pretty strongly that the Commission's existing planning rules are not sufficient to develop the planned transmission for states' offshore wind deployment goals. And we also heard that assigning costs from these transmission projects right now are likely not commensurate with benefits, and therefore there may no longer be just and reasonable. And commenters identified that under certain cost allocation methods, many users benefit from the upgrades, but don't bear any of the costs. There was also some disagreement on whether to focus on interconnection and transmission planning reforms solely for offshore wind, so to speak, to create a dedicated mechanism for offshore wind planning, or to take a broader reform approach. Some commenters thought the commission should go in the direction of creating a dedicated mechanism. Others thought, no, let's look at this with a technology neutral lens. And then finally, there was a lot of discussion of interregional transmission, and this was acknowledged as a major challenge, but also a unique opportunity for offshore wind, and that this could really be well suited for offshore wind, particularly given the geographic location of many of the existing offshore wind lease areas. And the Commission's current planning frameworks under Order 1000 require interregional coordination, but don't require these entities to conduct interregional planning. And again, that's something, as I just mentioned, that the ANOPR is taking comment on and considering whether there's more coordination we could do. There was also a discussion of a clustering approach to interconnecting offshore wind. Some commenters thought clustering or other forms of sort of shared upgrades would definitely improve efficiency. And in some cases in New England, that's something that is moving forward already. But others said, clustering is a good interim step, but to really capture the benefits that an offshore grid or an offshore backbone would offer, we need to focus on regional and interregional planning to get there. And finally, again, on the minimizing the environmental impacts, there seems to be a lot of opportunities to use the planning processes to optimize the use of cable paths, both to shore, both offshore and on the cable, to minimize cable layings. So our next steps right now are we have been analyzing the comments we received on wind. We are continuing to think through this. The ANOPR, again, is open for public comment, which runs through October 12th. And I hope interested folks here will comment to the extent they have comments to offer. You'll see in the ANOPR there is this technology neutral lens, but there are a couple places where we've called out offshore wind. And I am very excited to see what we get. I think we're going to get a lot of comments from what we've heard so far. And we're just very grateful to the stakeholders at this conference and the others who've already provided conference, and really look forward to engaging with everyone in the future as well as on this panel. So that's my kind of brief tour of two pieces of what very quickly become complicated and jargony, but happy to answer questions and chat with everybody. So thank you.
Thank you, David. As you were talking, I was thinking that maybe next year, Poet, we should do a dedicated session on just explaining transmission to the marine energy folks, that they would probably benefit a lot from kind of a more 101 style approach. I have a lot of questions for you, David, but I'm going to save them until after Amit goes, and when we can wrap it all up as a panel discussion. That'll be great. Thank you. So Amit, you're up, and Poet folks, do you mind spotlighting Amit?
All right. Thank you. So Rebecca asked me to talk kind of generally on what are the energy policies in Congress looking like, and I understand later on you're going to have a session that's just talking about policies directly related to WAVE. So I was going to do more of a broad brush just because there's tons and tons going on. And if you have questions, follow up with any questions on stuff that's of particular interest to folks. So I'm going to put it in three buckets because Senator Cantwell sits on three committees that are key to all these questions. And I'll tell you what's going on in those committees right now. So the first, we have the Finance Committee. We talked a little bit about this already, but right now we're processing really a historic sized package of clean energy tax incentives. And there's a couple dynamics there that are, I think, of interest. First, there's just the raw size. We're talking $300 billion plus package, way bigger. We've been involved. Senator Cantwell has been very active in these packages in the past, and this kind of blows the doors off, or I'm trying to think of a water metaphor, a big wave, tsunami of incentives. And the idea here is to really try and accelerate clean energy deployment. The economics are already very favorable relative on new generation, but there is a displacement that needs to happen, and the goal here is to displace that, provide the certainty to industry of long-term tax credits. So these are largely 10-year proposals. We saw when there was a bill with Senator Cantwell bill with Senator Ensign that created the 8-year tax credit in 2008, and that was really instrumental in help that long-term certainty of the tax credit, as opposed to we saw in wind going on and off for many years, allowed supply chains to develop and allowed big projects, allowed utility scale. There were other, of course, factors happening, but allowed the solar to really take off and get to the scale that it needed to drive down the cost to where we see today. So that's on the table. And another important component, at least from the Senate side, is Chairman Wyden has been a big proponent of trying to switch over. There's every technology is essentially called out in the code, but to try to make a more tax neutral approach that's based on a greenhouse gas metric, regardless of the energy source, or it wouldn't be called out in the technology. The House version of this package doesn't have that same provision, so that still needs to be worked out. But essentially, Chairman Wyden envisions in 2 years we transfer over to this technology neutral approach. Same robustness in terms of the credit. The other thing that is new in this tax package is of noteworthy and relevance to ocean energy is we're trying to, in some are very intent, and it's in the current proposals, to put in other metrics of linkages to the tax credits. So that is domestic content requirement I'm talking about, labor standards, things like that traditionally have not been part of the tax code, even some linkages to apprenticeship requirements in some cases. So I think the relevance there in terms of WAVE, that some of the technologies here are kind of inherently more domestic manufacturing, a little more blue collar, as opposed to, say, a high tech investment is needed to manufacture a solar panel. So I think that should be of interest and something to track for you guys. The other thing I wanted to mention there, and is a big Cantwell priority, is we are pushing hard for, we're doing electric vehicles is big in there, but we're trying to focus on non-passenger electric vehicles. So the linkage here is in the marine space. We see huge opportunities in electrifying both ports and all the equipment there, but also marine vessels, not just pure electric, but hybrids and all sorts of other ways to fuel cell powered vehicles. And that may be of interest given the relationship there. I think it speaks to, in terms of our view, and it's kind of a message on this overall package, is Senator Cantwell authored the $7,500 tax credit on EVs, and we did that in 2007. Well, it became law in 2008, and there were no EVs on the market. Now we're in a very different place. So we see the tax credits both as bootstrapping new technologies, but also this package, as you can see, is also about getting arguably commercially ready technologies out there. So that's what we got going on in the Finance Committee and the Energy Committee. You know, Paul talks a lot of the stuff, the R&D that Paul's working on has been authorized in years past. In the last couple of years, we had pretty robust packages that focused on ocean energy, and there's great work that's being done there. We have a linkage to that we focus on through Pacific Northwest National Lab, where Rebecca sits, and the SQUIM lab, which is the only ocean focused lab in the DOE lab structure. And so they do a lot of that work there. And that includes not just R&D, but demo programs, good things like that. We are going to be focusing on this coming out of the Endless Frontiers Act, which is a larger package on how to get kind of the US into a more competitive space on R&D, but on ocean monitoring, setting up a new ocean monitoring program, which looks at where our oceans are. A lot of it has through a climate lens. We have a pretty robust program that looks at our atmosphere that a lot of labs and universities participate in, but not a lot on the ocean side. So that's something else that may be of interest. And then transmission is a very big priority for us. And mainly we're looking at it through the energy committee trying to make big investments. So in the pending Senate bipartisan bill, which already passed the Senate, pending in the House now, we put in a couple programs. There's a $2.5 billion program that would have DOE be able to buy capacity contracts on pending transmission lines to try and spur financing of those projects. And then we have $3 billion for a smart grid program. We also wrote, Senator Cantwell originally wrote it in 2007. Now we're revitalizing it. And so it's cost shared grants in the smart grid space, but we think we can do a lot more given the level of need that Paul highlighted in his slides. Basically, again, we can't get there without much better transmission, both to link up sources from remote places to demand centers and also to balance supplies. And then finally in the commerce space, which Commerce Committee, the Senator chairs the Commerce Committee now, and that has jurisdiction over oceans. So there's a lot of policy implications there that could be of relevance. I mean, fundamentally, there's a lot of uses of our oceans. Oceans are vast, but people are using them for different things, whether that's fishing or there's ocean energy applications. There's quite a bit of conservation reserved areas along our shores. And so when we talk about ocean energy and bringing that transmission, that energy onshore to interties and what have you, there's issues to be worked out there that we're focusing on through that committee, along with the port electrification stuff that I talked about. So that's kind of a quick overview of a couple of things we're working on, and happy to take any questions.
Great, thank you, Amit. I have to say that if we had conducted this panel 3 years ago, we wouldn't have the same conversation. And so it's kind of mind-boggling, I think, for some of us that have been in this industry for some time, just how fast this is coming up. And so I know that we got at least one question about this, but it's probably the obvious one, which is, what are your thoughts about marine renewable energies opportunities, given all of these big trends and trajectories? So for example, David, I think you tried to make that connection in yours when you were talking about, single lines and benefits to the transmission system that maybe aren't being compensated, or those people aren't paying for the transmission that provides the benefits. Maybe you could take the extra step here and draw the connection. And then POET folks, I know if you don't mind resetting us into more of a gallery style so we can all communicate with a more Q&A style, that'd be great. But maybe could I ask each of you to go around and just offer a little bit more specific thoughts? And Amit, can we start with you, please?
Sure. I mean, I'll be frank, we're talking about all this clean energy future. Most people don't think that ocean energy is part of it. They think offshore wind is, I guess, but not wave and not tidal. And I guess there's a couple of reasons for that. Obviously, the commercialization and scale is not there in this industry. I worked at ERE, where Paul works now, 20 years ago, and I wrote a memo to the then Assistant Secretary with some other folks that said we should restart the ocean energy program. The program in the past had just been focused on OTEC, but we saw potential there. And, we think we need to frankly discuss why wave hasn't come up and offered to be part of this diverse portfolio that now everybody's looking for. There's certainly merit in the diversity and the location and the timing where it could have a huge contributor. But unlike some of the other technologies like solar, we don't have the scale that'll bring down the cost yet, or in the learning by doing. So I think that is a important question. These credits we're talking about have been there. They're going to be tech neutral, so maybe that'll help, or maybe the overall focus will help, or maybe clearing up the regulatory environment will help. But I think that's an open question, personally.
Thank you for that answer. I guess and maybe I should have a second part to this question as we keep going around, which is it important to, all of the things that we're talking about doing for offshore wind, is there any reason why they can't be more broadly available for any energy development that's offshore, or does it need to be specific to wind? So, and I don't know the answer. I'm really just asking. It's something that I've observed, is that offshore wind is obviously much more prepared to be commercial, but I don't know if the if the push for offshore wind is really about specifically wind, taking advantage of a wind resource, or if it's really just about commercializing energy resources offshore. So maybe you could just offer your thoughts on that.
I mean, I'll just give one more comment before Heather goes, but this is also an international competitiveness issue too, where there are other countries that are ahead of us in wave that are looking at it, certainly ahead of us in offshore wind. I think we're way behind the ball for a lot of reasons don't have to get into, but maybe there is a opportunity with clarifying the offshore wind. There is a massive goal that's set by the administration on offshore wind, but again, wave energy is being left behind in some of those policy discussions, and I think that's something to be corrected, really.
David? Thank you.
This is a great question. I mean, I agree. A couple of years ago, we thought offshore wind, was just never going to be a thing, and we were totally wrong about that. And I think, now we see it as a cornerstone for the New England states to meet their decarbonization goals and their economic development goals, as Amit said, and it's only starting. I mean, I think we've been looking at what the quantity of offshore wind that's in these state procurements right now. The decarbonization goals probably imply a lot more than we see in the queue right now. That just makes it all the more important to get the transmission piece of that puzzle right, because it's going to unlock much lower costs. And it's all happened very quickly. At this conference in October, we had folks from the state of Massachusetts talking about, their procurements and how they were thinking about transmission. And they said, to date, we've just been bundling transmission and generation, which means lead line, but we know we need to change that. And we're thinking about how to do that. And we're talking with our neighbors about how to do that. And they really have been. It's if you Google, or I'll try and find the link to their planning on this, but they're doing a lot of planning and trying to figure it out. I think the same is probably true for any other marine technology that's similar to wind. And I think many of them, there are a lot of similarities, so I can't promise to be intimately familiar with the unique characteristics of every prospective marine technology, but it's sort of the same idea. It's, with wind, we have these lease areas, they're in specific places. There's only a couple ways to get there that makes sense. And then it just becomes a question of, well, how much do you think we're going to do and when? And then you start thinking about the transmission. The problem with the processes today is that based on comments, not my view, but based on our comments so far, is that we don't have the economic signals right. Planning with a 10-year time horizon gets you to a certain answer. Who bears the costs, depending on how you plan, gets you to a certain answer. So, for example, when you do a bundled procurement of transmission and generation, that results in trying to entry into the transmission system through the generator interconnection process. And to the extent that there's an upgrade on the transmission system required by that, the generator pays the full cost of that. So the state ratepayers then see they're paying for a transmission upgrade and a lead line. But if they coordinated those, that would be a lot cheaper. But there isn't an incentive to do that because the generator interconnection process doesn't do that. There's a certain, it's basically, if you caused the need for the upgrade, you pay. And one of the key questions in the ANOPR is, should that change? Should we be doing more planning now based on what we see on the system, this anticipatory planning? And that's not to say that that doesn't happen now. There are processes in the RTOs for states to put their public policies into those 10-year regional plans, but that hasn't happened a lot in the multi-state RTOs. In states like New York, it has. And we had CAISO, California ISO, come in the wind record and leave a comment saying, we think our processes would result in those types of outcomes. So really interesting question. I think there's a lot of synergy between what is happening with wind now, because it's here now, and what could be needed for these other marine technologies.
David, this is awesome. But I want to just break it down one more level to make sure people got it, what you were just saying. So lead lines meaning like a single line that's a primary line out to a generator or something that's connecting, which means that you end up with kind of these single lines to connect all of these individual devices. And the question is there a way to be more planful and do that in a way that results in fewer lines or bigger lines or whatever it is, that if you knew that all those generators were going to come through, you would build a different system than all of these individual lines, right? And the costs would be better and the development trajectory would maybe have fewer impacts and siting. That's one of the questions. And then the other one was kind of that when you're looking at offshore, when you're onboarding energy and you're thinking about the grid condition that's being onboarded at, there might be an off-taker on the other side of that grid and it requires some upgrades. And so there's a generator cost that's assigned to that, but that the benefits might be more broadly accommodated. And so there's a need to bundle and kind of look holistically at what all of those upgrades are actually achieving and who's benefiting from them, as opposed to assigning them all to a single generator, which maybe misassigns costs and benefits if you're looking at the system more broadly. And I'm not sure if I stated that perfectly, but I just want to kind of break it down for the marine energy people who are thinking about, you know, basically they're stuck in terms of which grids they can interact with, right? They don't have a lot of options. And for a lot of marine energy resources, we're talking about off-takers, people buying the energy that are not the first point of interconnection. So those are really material issues for marine energy development, certainly in the Northwest. So I guess did I get that right? Or can you correct me, please, about the ideas there?
No, I think those are the right ideas. You know, I think, you know, because of the way the procurements have been structured to date, the way that's resulting in these single line projects, not always. I mean, in New England, there is a cluster off Cape Cod that they did. And what that means is instead of running, you know, 6 lead lines, you're running one big lead line, and then all the individual projects or generators are connecting to that line. But then the other piece of this that happens is if you create congestion, or if the onshore transmission system, like those big metal structures that you see, you know, when you're driving on the highway, if your generator requires some piece of that infrastructure or a substation upgrade, then those full costs go to you. And two different questions there. The first is, if you go back, if you study each individual generator and you do 3 upgrades, would it be less expensive to just do one large upgrade that gets everybody through? That's the first piece. And then the second piece is on the benefits side, because the person who creates the need for the system upgrade typically pays for that system upgrade. Are there other people who benefit from those upgrades? And the place where we hear that the most is, or have heard that the most is, you know, if they've created like a backbone or like a offshore network where they have a gathering platform where offshore, where multiple generators are interconnecting and it can flow power, you know, from New Jersey south to New Jersey north, you know, are there other benefits of having that additional transmission capacity offshore? And who benefits from that? And that's all very contentious. You know, a lot of the current rules, you know, my take on that is that, you know, they're kind of these brokered settlements among states where, you know, they have these agreements that have worked well in the past where, you know, but I mean, you know, ultimately, you know, people, there can be a lot of contentious issues around costs. And when, you know, you have a state like Ohio who's in the same grid as New Jersey, and there's, you know, potentially a benefit to Ohio from some congestion that New Jersey's offshore wind, you know, and I'm talking all hypothetically here, that their offshore wind relieved, you know, therefore they should be paying for part of New Jersey's offshore wind transmission upgrades. That gets tricky. You know, people get tripped up in that, and that's part of the place where the commission's spending a lot of time thinking about, you know, how do we get those benefits right, those costs right.
It's interesting because that's kind of fundamental to grid, though. I mean, that's fundamental. Like if you have to fix it in one place, the costs are socialized across all of the users. I mean, at least in the Northwest, we have a lot of practice in some cost allocations based on utility investments that are socialized across the system and all customers, regardless of this precise location. So it's an interesting, I would love to learn more, David. Maybe this is going back to like how it works right now kind of thing. So we understand what what the significance is of some of these innovations that you're talking about, and how far departure those are.
Yeah, and you're right, and there's lots of nuances to cost allocation, but I mean, in general, the beneficiaries pay, and to the extent that there's something on the transmission system that is identified in the regional planning processes, that those costs are assigned to those who benefit. But the place where we are now is like, if the states don't have a shared public policy, now that's challenging. And there are, I don't want to say that those rules don't exist right now. They do. There are public policy planning processes, but I think what we've heard from commenters are that those aren't used or perhaps aren't working so well. So we're taking comment on that, and we're also taking comment on other ways to do it. So stay tuned. I mean, I think it'll be really interesting, in a couple months to see what we get and where that takes us.
Appreciate it. And I guess I don't mean to overemphasize that within the panel, but it does seem like it's a really interesting nexus point of the operational realities of the grid, the planning realities, the financial and market realities of the grid, right? And then the policy and ability to influence all of those. And how it kind of ricochets across systems. So appreciate all the good work you're doing to try to unpack that and make it work well. Paul, now you started us off way back when talking about all these big futures and how many different network solutions there could be. Please offer your thoughts about what is the role of marine energy in any of this.
Sure. So I think three things. So I think to David's point, I think once people start thinking about longer time horizons, I think that might change some of the deployment you see. Obviously, if you're only looking 10 years out without thinking about public policy issues, you're probably not going to build enough clean energy in order to meet kind of your long-term goals. So I think thinking about longer term planning that takes into account policy will help. The second piece is probably on siting. So I think we're given the amount of clean energy we need to deploy, we're most likely going to run into new siting constraints and public acceptance issues for probably land-based resources. So I think that there's going to be an increased role for offshore resources to play in that space, because there's just less siting issues and less public acceptance issues potentially, especially if their planning is done in a coordinated way. And I think kind of the third thing I think is actually economic development. So I think as we've seen with offshore wind, it might not be a least cost resource, but it still gets built because it offers a lot of associated economic development, especially for coastal communities. So thinking about things like domestic and manufacturing and jobs. And so I think that there might be other types of benefits that marine energy can provide that will drive it to be deployed in both the near and medium term.
That was an excellent wrap up. I will say that there are a lot of people on this conference that have very strong views about siting offshore, but I appreciate your point that there might be increased pressure to develop offshore if onshore opportunities are really limited, right? So I get that point. And then
Rebecca, I wanted just one follow up to Paul. I think just on the other side of the we should plan longer, the other thing we heard was that like sometimes even within that 10-year window, things change very quickly, and there have been projects that have been identified that absolutely seem like no-brainers that have then not been canceled. So it's tricky. It's like it's very much a Goldilocks problem where like longer than 10 years makes sense for some of the emerging technologies, but also there's going longer introduces more uncertainty. So I just want to frame out both sides of that one.
Iteration is key there. I mean, to be able to take into the long-term trend, but also be able to stay flexible as the system evolves. So yeah, great point, David.
And risk. All right, this was awesome. I would have loved to have talked longer, but I know we need to wrap it up. So thank you all for participating with us. I hope you can hang on and hear from the next panel as well, but really appreciate your contributions today to this conference. All right, Poet, back to you.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. Also, Amit, Paul, David, for excellent opening panel with this Ocean Renewable Energy Conference. I always enjoy Rebecca's panels, and I think it's important to keep the big picture of the energy sector in the Northwest in mind. And these trends that are happening around the country are very relevant, and I think it's important for us to keep our eye on those policy and priority developments as certainly as we've seen over the last few months with the new Biden administration. Obviously, things are changing quickly. So thank you very much, Rebecca and other panelists. That was wonderful. We could have continued that conversation, I think, pretty much most of the day. So right now, Aaron is working in the background to get our next panel ready. We're going to start here in just a couple moments to have Shannon Souza's panel coming up on the pivotal role of ocean energy in strategies for rapid decarbonization and adaptation of the Pacific Northwest energy sector. As I mentioned earlier, Shannon Souza is policy director for POET. She's been working with us for about a year now and has been leading the charge here in Oregon in the various forums that are addressing policies related to marine energy, the Public Utility Commission and Oregon Department of Energy, the Northwest Power and Conservation Council, of course, the legislature, where we moved House Bill 3375 this year. So I'll stand down now, and I think the rest of the team will be ready here momentarily. So stay tight, and the next panel will start in just a couple of moments.